Hidden among the ruins are tales of women who donned armor and signed war decrees. They returned with tunics soaked in blood secrets fierce enough to scorch Rome's legacy to the ground. Roman law was clear: no women allowed in military camps. The official reasoning: they'd distract soldiers and weaken discipline. Emperor Augustus himself passed strict laws around 13 BCE, threatening harsh penalties. The ideal legion was a brotherhood of focused warriors, unencumbered by domestic distractions. At least, that's what the Senate claimed. But scrolls and shards of pottery tell a different story. Generals regularly ignored these laws, even when they knew they were being broken. Take the Vindolanda tablets, letters discovered near Hadrian's Wall. One commander complains about the excessive number of women in camp, yet does nothing to remove them. Another requests extra rations, specifically noting the women and children accompanying his troops. The army needed these women to function. Soldiers couldn't march, fight, and also cook, mend clothes, tend wounds, or maintain morale alone. Archaeological digs at Roman forts from Germania to Judea reveal hairpins, sewing needles, and children's shoes, proof families lived there constantly. At one fort in Bavaria, excavators found an entire block of barracks modified with small hearths and household items, suggesting long-term housing for soldiers' partners. This hypocrisy wasn't accidental, it was practical. One military manual from the late Empire admitted camps required those who clean, cook, and comfort. The writer never names these helpers directly, but the implication is clear. Surviving pay records show soldiers routinely sent money home, but also list unexplained deductions that may represent unofficial payments to camp vendors, many of whom were likely women. The greatest evidence comes from casualty reports. After battles, officers counted dead non-combatants alongside fallen soldiers. At the Teutoburg forest disaster, where 3 legions were slaughtered, later imperial records note many followers perished, a vague term often used for women and children. Why did Rome maintain this charade? Discipline mattered, until it didn't. When legions garrisoned remote frontiers for years, commanders tolerated what the capital condemned. The 3rd century, Cohursi Hamiorum, stationed in Britain, even erected a tombstone for a soldier's wife, blatantly documenting their forbidden presence. Rome's conquests depended on this open secret. Armies that tried enforcing the ban faced mass desertions. Letters from Egypt show soldiers threatening mutiny when separated from families. It turns out, soft needs like hot meals and companionship were as critical as swords and shields. So what work were these women actually doing in the shadows of the war machine? The answer redefines how we see Rome's military machine. Imagine the Rhine frontier around 100 AD, a river choked with military barges, the banks swarming with legionaries in heavy marching packs. Now look closer. Between the armored men walk, women carrying baskets, children clutching wooden toys, entire families moving with the army. This was forbidden. This was everyday reality. The Vindolanda tablets, letters preserved in the mud of a British fort, prove how common these illegal families were. One soldier scribbles a plea to his commanding officer: "Please send my wife the money I owe her." Another, stationed along Hadrian's Wall, receives an invitation from a fellow officer's wife to a birthday celebration. Archaeologists found infant skeletons buried near centurions' quarters at Alling, their tiny bones resting beside military issue belts and swords. These women did more than follow, they sustained. At nightfall, when soldiers collapsed, exhausted, someone had to grind grain for tomorrow's bread. When tunics ripped during brutal marches, someone repaired them with bone needles still found at sites like Mainz. A soldier's pay record from Egypt lists deductions for wife's upkeep, though officially he shouldn't have had one. The army turned a blind eye because it had to. Deployed for years in distant posts, men would desert without emotional anchors. A cavalry officer's letter from Vindolanda admits the truth. The men are restless without their women. Camps evolved into makeshift towns, with barrack blocks modified for family life. Shoe size analysis proves women and children lived not just in officers' quarters but throughout the forts. Their presence redefined military logistics. Marching columns stretched for miles, legionaries at the front, baggage trains behind, and thousands of followers trailing. When Tiberius campaigned in Germania, Tacitus notes the rabble of camp women slowed the army's retreat, proving their numbers. At Bedriacum in 69 AD, historians recorded non-combatants killed during battle, a euphemism for the wives and traders caught in the fighting. The work was relentless. Beyond cooking and sewing, women gathered firewood, tended livestock, confiscated from locals, and nursed the sick. A tombstone from Chester memorializes a soldier's wife, who lived with him 15 years at the fort. At Carnuntum on the Danube, archaeologists unearthed a child's leather shoe near the artillery barracks, its sole worn thin from playing on stone floors. Rome's conquests relied on this hidden labor. Without families providing stability, desertion rates would have crippled the frontier defenses. When Septimius Severus finally legalized soldier marriages in 197 AD, he merely acknowledged what had been practiced for centuries. Earlier emperors knew it too. Augustus's own troops rebelled when separated from partners. The archaeological record doesn't lie. Spindle whorls scattered in barracks prove women spun wool between battles. Glass beads from Cologne's military harbour suggest female merchants operated near dockyards. At Vindonissa in Switzerland, a woman's bronze mirror was found beside a legionary's dagger, intimate objects buried together in defiance of regulations. These weren't exceptions, they were the system. And when we examine the battlefields and fortresses where Rome's power was built, their fingerprints remain. In the cooking pots, the mended cloaks, the letters begging for news from home. The legions marched on full stomachs and patched uniforms because the women they officially banned were the ones keeping them functional. The marketplace outside a Roman fort at dawn was no place for the timid. Before the soldiers finished their morning drills, women were already unpacking baskets of bread, smoked fish, and medicinal herbs. At Oberstim, near the Danube, archaeologists found cooking pots and scales in what was clearly a tavern area, right inside the military compound. The coins and broken pottery tell us who ran these businesses. Women's names appear on merchant marks, and their graves contain measuring cups and purses full of coins. One ledger scratched on wood, found near Hadrian's Wall, lists sales of grain, leather straps, and lamp oil to legionaries. The handwriting is messy, hurried, someone keeping track of a thriving trade between battles. These women weren't just peddlers, they moved goods across enemy lines. A trader's ring found in Germania bore the insignia of a Roman metalsmith, suggesting she transported armor repairs to frontier troops. At Carnuntum, a tombstone commemorates a woman named Secundia Festica, who conducted business with the army for 20 years. Soldiers paid premiums for comforts from home, Spanish olive oil, Gallic wine, Egyptian linen, and these traders delivered, often dealing directly with suppliers in far-off provinces. Their networks stretched farther than any quartermasters. Commerce wasn't their only value. Women could go where soldiers couldn't. A Germanic seeress named Veleda became legendary for predicting Roman defeats, but lesser-known women passed more practical intelligence. Historians rarely recorded their names, but we know the pattern. A woman gathering herbs near a fort might note troop movements. A merchant's daughter visiting relatives across the border could return with rumors of tribal uprisings. The Romans weren't the only ones using this tactic. Britons employed female spies during Boudicca's revolt, knowing Roman sentries would scrutinize men more closely. At Vindolanda, a fragmentary letter mentions a most reliable source who warned of a Brigante ambush in 98 AD. The phrasing suggests a local informant, likely a woman trading with both sides. Another tablet from Egypt references a Syrian woman whose reports on Parthian troop positions saved a cavalry unit. Commanders tolerated these unofficial operatives because they worked. When trouble came, it was often a trader's wife who first spotted armed bands in the hills. The military economy couldn't function without them. Pay records show soldiers spending half their wages on extra rations, clothing repairs, and, despite regulations wine. Excavations at Niederbiber Fort revealed a row of burnt shops behind the barracks, their blackened floors littered with glassware and dice. These weren't army issue. They were the stock of private vendors catering to off-duty troops. The army looked away because every denarius spent there cycled back into the camp's ecosystem. Their profits had strategic value. During Trajan's Dacian wars, contractors supplied pack animals and grain to advancing legions. Many subcontractors were women running family businesses. A papyrus from Syria documents a shipment of 400 cloaks delivered by a Marcia, daughter of Gaius, to the 3rd Gallica Legion. Without these suppliers, the army would have starved in conquered territories. The artifacts don't lie. Spices from India in a German fort, British wool in a Judean outpost. These got there through networks greased by women's labor. At the fortress of Caerleon, a hoard of coins buried under a granary exactly matches the savings a merchant might stash. The grinding stones nearby still bear groves from preparing flour, not for the official rations, but for the bread sold to homesick soldiers. Rome called them camp followers. In truth, they were the supply lines, the bankers, the eyes and ears no commander could openly acknowledge. When a legion marched, it wasn't just swords that kept it moving, it was the woman selling boots to blistered recruits, the brewer's widow smuggling messages in ale casks, the informant whispering of ambushes in the fog. The battlefield after the fighting stopped was its own kind of horror. Men groaned on makeshift cots, their wounds seeping through bloody bandages. The air smelled of burned flesh and sour wine, the surgeon's crude antiseptic. Official records mention the army's Medici with their scalpels and cautery irons. What they don't show are the women moving through the chaos, pressing cloths to fevered brows and grinding herbs into pastes. A soldier named Lucius wrote home from Germania Superior, "The wound in my thigh festered for days." The surgeon said to amputate, but Celastia, a merchant's wife, smelled the rot and applied her poultice. In a week, the swelling broke. His letter survives because he scratched it onto a wooden tablet now preserved at Mainz. Like many, he credits his recovery not to military doctors, but to an unlicensed healer whose knowledge came from generations of passed-down wisdom. These women worked with plants no army manual listed. At Vindolanda, archaeologists found traces of yarrow, a herb that staunches bleeding, in the same layers as military equipment. In Egypt, a papyrus lists purchases of honey and garlic by camp followers, both known infection fighters. A grave near Cologne held a woman buried with dried chamomile bunches, still intact after centuries, their anti-inflammatory properties likely used to soothe wounded men. Mortality rates tell the hidden story. Legionaries posted to Britannia, where local women knew Celtic herbal remedies, had higher survival rates than those stationed in Syria, despite similar combat conditions. Excavated hospitals in Gaul show evidence of systematic wound care, bones healed cleanly, with few signs of gangrene. The tools responsible weren't always surgical. Mortar fragments with herb residues suggest medicinal preparations made on site. The army needed these women because their methods worked. Roman military medicine focused on visible wounds, setting bones, removing arrows, while infections killed more soldiers than blades. Camp healers understood this instinctively. A soldier's graffiti in Pompeii depicts a woman applying a salve, captioned, "She saved 10 men after Nuceria." Another inscription from Moesia thanks the wives who nursed us through the pestilence. Yet, official histories erase them. Medical treatises like Galen's mention female practitioners only to dismiss them as old wives. Tacitus describes battlefield medicine without noting who actually changed the dressings. Even the well-documented valetudinaria, military hospitals, show artifacts like cooking pots and cloth scraps, where women clearly worked, though no room is labeled for their use. Their absence from records was deliberate. Allowing women to practice medicine undermined the army's male hierarchy. A centurion's letter from Vindolanda complains about a healer named Vitellia, who freely gave counsel to the men, implying she bypassed the chain of command. Another tablet from Dura Europos mentions a dispute over payment, soldiers pooling money to compensate a healer outside official channels. The proof survives in unexpected places. A tombstone near the Danube shows a woman holding a cup and herbs, labeled Medica against all convention. At Caerleon, a hoard included a bronze syringe identical to army issue, but buried with a woman's jewelry. These fragments suggest a parallel medical corps operating in the shadows, their methods often more effective than approved treatments. When disaster struck, these healers became something more. During the siege of Cremona in 69 AD, historian Josephus notes, "Women carrying water to wounded men under arrow fire." A single line, easily missed, yet it reveals their transition to combat roles when survival demanded it. Rome's conquests relied on this hidden expertise. Every cleaned wound, every fever broken, every infection turned back meant another soldier returning to the line. The legion's strength wasn't just in their weapons, but in the women who put shattered men back together, one poultice, one bandage, one whispered reassurance at a time. If you're finding this buried history as eye-opening as we are, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There's a lot more Rome never wanted us to see. Dawn broke over the besieged fortress of Sadagolthina in Dacia, 105 AD. Rock dust from the night's bombardment still hung in the air when the attackers came again, this time with scaling ladders. Normally, the women would have been sheltering in the cellars, but these weren't normal times. 3 days without reinforcements, 2 wells poisoned. And now, as the iron-tipped ladders clanged against the walls, something unexpected happened. Our only account comes from Trajan's column in Rome. Between scenes of triumphant legionaries, one panel shows a woman hurling a rock from the battlements. She's not in armor, just a tunic and shawl. The sculptor tucked her near the edge, easy to miss, but she's there, alongside another woman pouring boiling oil. Why? Because when survival's at stake, even Rome's strictest rules bend. These weren't trained soldiers, they were bakers, wives, leatherworkers, people who called the fort home. A legionary fort wasn't just a military base, it housed butchers, laundries, even schools. When attackers came, the women defending those walls weren't thinking about military law. They were protecting their children sleeping in the barracks, their market stalls, the infirmary where they'd treated wounds for years. Official records call this civilian resistance. Archaeology suggests it was more organized. At Masada in Judea, excavators found a hidden cache of child-sized slingshots, too small for adult hands, near the defenders' quarters. In Moesia, a centurion's report mentions local women helping hold the east gate during a surprise attack. Their names aren't recorded, but the detail survives because he needed to explain why that sector held when others fell. These moments were rare but decisive. Roman law technically allowed women to defend their domiciles, a loophole that stretched when home was a military fortress. During Boudicca's revolt, Tacitus writes of women guarding supply trains, not just from looters, but in pitched battles. He disapproves, calling it against nature, but admits their intervention saved entire units. The military tolerated this because it worked. At the siege of Cyzicus in 193 AD, historian Dio Cassius notes women patched breaches in the walls with their own cloaks while under arrow fire. Their actions, officially improvised, bought enough time for reinforcements to arrive. Nobody punished them. Nobody questioned why they were on the ramparts. Survival outweighed protocol. Afterwards, these events got downplayed or mythologized. The woman on Trajan's column has no name. The Mosian gate defenders are called auxiliary support in later reports. At Masada, Josephus spins a dramatic tale of mass suicide, but skips over the mundane reality that someone had to organize the resistance while the men fought. Artifacts fill the gaps the histories leave. A child's leather sandal found near the armory at Vindolanda, its sole worn thin from running messages. A bent kitchen knife from Carnuntum with its edge sharpened to a razor finish. The tombstone of Valeria Victrix in Germany, a woman buried with a spear and spindle, honored simply as protector of the 12th. Rome's greatest military contradiction wasn't that women fought, it was pretending they didn't when survival demanded it. Modern historians often dismiss these accounts as legends or exceptions. But when we check the dates, these so-called exceptions cluster during sieges, rebellions, and frontier collapses, exactly when manpower ran thinnest. The pattern repeats across the empire. Artifacts show women living in forts, letters prove they maintained supply lines, casualty reports list them as casualties. Is it really surprising they'd pick up weapons when the alternative was death? The evidence has always been there, we just didn't ask the right questions. So when you see that small figure on Trajan's column, remember, she wasn't breaking the rules, she was proving them inadequate. Because the real story of Rome's military isn't in the laws they passed, it's in the desperate moments when those laws were ignored. The question isn't why women fought, it's why we assumed they didn't. For centuries, Roman historians wrote women out of military history. Tacitus dismissed camp followers as useless mouths, while Livy framed them as distractions from soldierly duty. What changed? Archaeology forced a reckoning with the truth. The evidence was always there. We just weren't looking properly. 19th century diggers at Roman forts tossed aside domestic rubbish like hairpins and spindle whorls, keeping only swords and armor. A bias preserved in museum collections. Stuttgart's Landesmuseum once displayed 40 cases of military gear, while shelving the cooking pots and children's shoes from the same site. But these unimportant finds tell the real story. The silence served a purpose. Ancient historians like Josephus wanted to portray Roman armies as disciplined brotherhoods. Admitting women's roles undermined that image. A telling example, Plutarch describes Pompey's camp in 48 BC as having no loose women, yet contemporaneous letters from soldiers mention visiting local prostitutes near the same location. The contradiction wasn't accidental. Modern technology exposes these lies. Isotope testing on bones from Bavarian forts shows many camp followers were actually local girls, integrated into military life. Scanning electron microscopy proves medicinal pottery shards contain traces of pain, killing herbs like willow bark. Even Trajan's column, that masterpiece of imperial propaganda, hides women in plain sight, if you know where to look. The cost of ignoring this was immense. Textbook maps of Roman forts still label areas as barracks or armories, leaving blank spaces where women clearly lived and worked. Reconstructions show only male soldiers milling about, despite artifact evidence proving children played between the horse stables. This isn't just inaccurate, it's bad history. The implications are profound. If we've been wrong about women's military roles, what else did we miss? Recent studies suggest female traders funded entire campaigns through supply networks. Others propose that medics' wives may have pioneered early vaccination techniques using pus from smallpox survivors. This isn't about political correctness, it's about evidence. The same drills that produced perfect soldier graves also turned up women buried with spearheads and knives. The same tablets recording troop movements note payments to female spies. Rome's armies didn't march alone, and pretending otherwise distorts our understanding of how empires really function. The artifacts don't lie. From the Rhine to the Euphrates, the proof sits in museum storage rooms, loom weights beside arrowheads, infant teeth near cavalry spurs, love letters mixed with military dispatches. For every Trajan boasting of masculine conquest, there's a worn-down grindstone whispering the truth, that Rome's military machine depended on invisible labor, and that labor had a woman's face. Rome's legacies were built as much on hidden labor as on battlefield tactics. The women we've discussed weren't exceptions, they were integral to the military machine. Their stories, long buried in artifacts and overlooked texts, force us to rewrite history. Now it's your turn. Which role surprised you most? The camp followers defying orders? The battlefield healers? The merchants funding conquests? Or the women who seized weapons when survival demanded? History hides more than we know, so what else awaits discovery?